So Trump, half the world love him, half the world hate him. Has got himself into trouble again, Sean.
Very unhelpful comments this week where he's been effectively questioning NATO, questioning the whole role of NATO, questioning that people who aren't paying their dues, frankly, he turned around and said, wouldn't be protected by America, and almost be encouraging Russia and others to attack them. Face value, absolutely appalling. Part of the whole premise of NATO is that it provides a protection for a collection of countries. It's a team sport. It's all about an attack on one being an attack on all. And of course, all of this is because Trump is trying to play into a domestic audience, USA first, which is his mantra.
MAGA.
What is MAGA?
Make America Great Again.
Oh, there we go, yeah. But that's exactly what he's doing. And in American politics, they throw a lot of spears about. And, you know, the trouble is, if you go below that, I have to say I have a degree of sympathy with the essential elements of his argument, because we as our nation, we pay 2% of our GDP into defence. And back in 2014, NATO turned around and said all of our members should at least spend 2%. And by 2024, by the end of the decade, you should all be doing that. Today, of the 31 members of NATO, only 11 meet that requirement, with the US spending 3.5% of GDP. So understandably, they're looking going, hang on a minute, we're funding the defence, and we're the superpower involved here. Why should we be protecting countries like Italy that are refusing to pay their dues? And there is a point there, particularly when we've talked in the podcast, do we spend more money in defence? And if we do that, we've got to take it away from somewhere else.
I mean, I think the point you made about it being potentially political and national political, I think it's a good one. I think we're going to come on to it when we talk about the world's response to what Israel is doing in Gaza. So, yeah, I mean, in an election year, which is where we are in the US, people are after votes. You know, do you forgive him for that? Probably not. But the second thing is, I think it's very hard to actually see what people like Trump say, because his words are often taken out of context. So I think you need to listen to the sort of 5-10 minutes and then see how you feel about it. The third comment I make is that if you want to wake up a sleepy giant, which is what he may feel, you may disagree, that NATO is, you have to poke them quite hard to get a response. And it could be that's his sort of tactics, you know.
I agree. Bizarrely, I do agree. I think, first of all, NATO's been around for quite some time, 80 or 75 years. It's therefore not unreasonable there's a review of what it stands for. I personally, as a British taxpayer and a member of the military, former member of the military forces here, think before we start upping our defence spending, we should be making sure other members of the club are meeting their requirements. I think that's entirely reasonable. But I also think that there has been and it's a bit dangerous ground here, but I think there has been a degree of complacency in Europe about America's so huge, it spends huge amounts of money on defence, they're funding NATO, what's the risk to us? Then all of a sudden Russia invades on the European continent. And there's a lot of countries like Poland suddenly upping their defence spending that are going, oh, crumbs. Now, it's a bit late then, because you can't suddenly create a robust defensive capability overnight. So I do think there is value in sometimes shaking the tree a bit. And the other thing, I think it's called the Weimar Triangle, was a defunct partnership arrangement between France, Germany and Poland. They all had a vested interest in trying to make sure that, because they're at the heart of Europe, is safe. And they're now re-instigating a whole series of conversations to see whether there's merit in actually Europe taking a bit more of the lead in defending Europe, which I think is probably healthy. It's not a bad thing.
So maybe, because it's very easy to find negatives about Trump and, I guess positives as well. Maybe we give him a break to start a conversation, which we're going to track and see how NATO responds.
I think it's a really good example of something where the soundbite, exactly as you said, we get attracted by the soundbite and pour scorn on, but actually below the surface, there's actually subliminally a really positive message. And I think, as you say, we're going to come on to another one of those with Grant Shapps later, but it's really important. So, Bern, following on this theme of like Trump and what's behind the headlines, Grant Shapps has been in the headlines this week for allegedly getting angry at sort of the woke agenda around the MOD about, trying to achieve targets rather than focus on operational effectiveness. And also, the Royal Navy has apparently been focused on looking at the sort of green agenda as well. But you and I have had a bit of conversation about this. You've got some views about it. What's your take?
So this is DEI, yeah, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. I, from a personal point of view, I'm not. There's two things for me. One is I'm not happy with the DEI agenda. I don't think it's diverse. I think it bases its objectives on equal outcomes, not equal opportunities, which I think is wrong. And when it talks about inclusion, it depends who's speaking, but sometimes it means everybody's inclusive apart from us. We can be exclusive. So I think it's a muddled idea, and I'm not happy that large institutions have adopted it with that much thought. If it means that you set agendas to recruit certain types of people ahead of others, then I'm worried that it's not based on merit. Now, if a company wants to do it, fine, as long as they stay within the law. But if the military want to do it, I'm a little concerned about then the ultimate ability to fight our enemies.
Yeah, and this is a good example of getting behind the headlines, isn't it? So the Grant Shapps point was that it was alleged that the British Army were looking at reducing the security vetting requirements for overseas personnel to join the military, because that was stopping a lot of them joining. And it wasn't that long ago that the Royal Air Force was being pilloried for overlooking male, pale and stale candidates to try and get more diversity and try and meet targets, as if the targets was the main focus, and therefore you'd be prepared to compromise operational capability on the altar of meeting diversity targets. The problem is, I have a slightly different take on all of this. So, for example, I was an instructor on the Jet Provost many, many years ago, and we didn't have female pilots at the time. And it was decreed that we should be having female pilots, but there were no role models. There were no female pilots within the service, so people didn't see themselves in the service, therefore nobody was applying. So the first tranche of females that we got in, there was a lot of effort put in to make sure that some made it through to the front line. And that created a lot of friction at the time, because it was felt that maybe some of the other candidates were being overlooked in favour of females. But what happened once that period was over and we had some female role models, later in my career I was a squadron commander and then a force commander of the whole Harrier force. And I was very proud to have female pilots who were just as good, if not better, than their male counterparts. And now we had role models within the service that people could aspire to. They could see themselves in the service, and therefore we were attracting people. So our service benefited from having diversity. And I think part of the challenge is that the service should represent the population it protects. And if there are large segments of that society which are not represented in the service, how do we create role models? How do we get them in? And it's not, from my perspective, absolutely shouldn't be done just to meet targets. But if it makes us better because we're harnessing skills and experience that we wouldn't otherwise have, then I think it's a good thing. And to take it out of the military domain, it wasn't that long ago that the Labour Party, remember they had female-only lists for MPs back in the 1990s, because they said we've just not got enough females MPs. So, and it was challenged in court, but eventually they did continue it because the argument was they're underrepresented. Now I think they've got 51% of their MPs or more are female, And there was a suggestion they were going to look at all female lists again, and that was stopped in court because they went, hang on a minute, that is not reasonable, that's not fair, because actually you're not underrepresented, you are equally represented, therefore you can't have female lists. So I do think it's a challenge not only for the military, it's a challenge for industry as well. You've worked in industry, you know, it helps sometimes to have different perspectives, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if it happened in my company, I'd stop it. That sort of approach, I'd stop. In my software business, we have probably the widest diversity for a small company of any company in the world. But, you know, we've recruited people on merit. We haven't said we want this number. And it's worked. And my view is, if there is an issue, the causes of that issue should be addressed. You know, the fundamentals. I think it's a bit lazy just to exclude people on the basis that you'll get more of the other side. And I won't name the company, but a very large multinational the other day, the boss said, if we're thinking of recruiting any white men, then I want to interview them first. You know, I think it's lazy. And actually doesn't work.
No, I agree, but I guess our point is this is not just a problem for the military. You know, I've got a very good friend who works in the city, one of the big four firms. They are concerned the number of females on their boards, and therefore they are a number of female partners.
Too many or too less?
Too few.
Yeah.
So they are promoting some of the females above their males in order to address that balance, and that's causing all sorts of friction. And it's not suggesting for any minute that it should be absolutely done on merit. It's not, in order to try to achieve those targets. And they said that one of the challenges is that you'll meet the targets. The danger is that the business isn't there to achieve targets; it's there to make money.
Yeah, and that applies to the military as well. The blood and treasure in the military, that's got to be the goal. I mean, I know this is turning into a long subject, but I'd spent the last 40 years in the tech industry, which up until quite recently was very much underrepresented by females, and the issue wasn't solved by setting quotas, which I completely disagree with. It was solved actually by dealing with the attitude of middle management men who deliberately, because they were prejudiced against women's ability in the tech world, it prejudiced them about promoting and developing. So women got dismissed from the process as opposed to being, positively selected. As that was dealt with, and the dinosaurs in the tech industry, which were pretty macho, disappeared, then women's contribution, flourished. And, I wouldn't want to draw an equivalence between men and women in the tech industry or any other gender, but, it worked out brilliantly, as it happens.
And that's why I think getting behind these stories is a bit more to it than this. Yeah. I always think it's very easy to say it's just ticking to get quotas. From my perspective, it's absolutely about getting the best military force you can. If that means we need to have a more diverse workforce, because in my experience, that will create benefits for the military, then we need to go very hard at it. And it's not just a challenge to the military, it's also one for society.
Yeah, right. So, Sean, something big and complex and quite difficult is happening in Rafah in Gaza. And it's also stimulating further international attention and advice on Israel.
One of the challenges is that Prime Minister Netanyahu's made clear his priorities are to destroy Hamas and liberate the hostages. More about that another time. But destroying Hamas seems to be a 3-phase operation. They went into the north of Gaza, cleared that. They went to the middle of Gaza, focused on Khan Yunis, which is the home of Yahya Sinwar, the boss of Hamas. And although they're still fighting there, in effect, they're now preparing for the final phase, which is down in the south of Rafah. Part of the challenge, though, is they've been clearing Palestinians out as they go, telling them to move south. So of the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, well over 1 million of those have moved south and are now massively compressed in the small region in the south called Rafah, right on the Egyptian border, with Israel poised to do the next phase of its offensive. Now, if you look at the tent city, there's a 2 square mile tent city, sprawling tent city in Rafah, and you look at pictures of that, how on earth a military operation will be able to differentiate a soldier to a Hamas fighter, to a civilian, to a hostage? Almost impossible. And if you were to do any form of bombing campaign, it's going to be brutal for the local population.
Do you think they'll use planes and bombs?
They've already started using bombs. And so the international community has massive increase in diplomatic language. So President Biden, talked about Netanyahu being over the top. You've had former First Lady Hillary Clinton saying that Netanyahu's untrustworthy and that needed to go. This is from Israel's main supporter and partner. And all of it's about concerns about what Netanyahu's going to do next and trying to get him to pause. Now, Netanyahu's turned around and said, no, clearly it's going to be a difficult job. So I've challenged my forces to work out how they're going to relocate these Palestinians. But frankly, there's only 4 options. Either they got put in a tent city in a sort of green belt, which is near the sea, just to sort of west-northwest of Rafah. But the United Nations said, we are not going to be complicit in helping you forcibly relocate Palestinians. You either then move them south through the Egypt border.
Who doesn't want them?
Egypt's massing forces on the border now because they know full well if those Palestinians come in, they're not going out again.
And they might invite a lot of other people in.
Correct.
At the same time.
Or you go east and you let those Palestinians into Israel, not a hope in hell. Or you push the Palestinians back north again. But if you look at the devastation that's happened, there's nothing left for them. You're also putting them further away from the aid which flows through Rafah as well.
And this is the tented city or the area which is run by UNRWA, United Nations.
Yeah, with all of that entail. But they think Israel say there's 4 battalions of Hamas left. A battalion is between 300 and 1,000 fighters. And of course, Yahya Sinwar is still around. So from Netanyahu's perspective, I can't finish the war until I've wiped out these 4 battalions. But there is, and there was a peace proposal on the table as well for the last week. The US trying desperately to get a peace proposal out there. Doesn't look like that's going to work. But it's really interesting to see what happens next because it'll be I think the UN said it'll be a bloodbath if Israel goes into Rafah with force, but it looks like they're determined to do that.
Well, I mean, I think one thing is clear. Israel are not going to stop. Whether we think it's a good thing or a bad thing, they're not going to stop. So if the world actually wants to do something about it, talking to Israel and get them to stop, I don't think it's going to work. And by the way, my other feeling, Sean, is that when President of the United States of America or the Prime Minister of Great Britain or anybody else who's leading a country at the moment, from a political point of view, they have to stand up and say, Israel, we want you to stop fighting, cease for long enough so you can get the hostages out, etc., etc. I don't believe a word of it. I think they're doing it, all these leaders, is my cynical view, they're doing it for local political issues. They know they can't say the opposite, so they're going with something that sounds, from a humanitarian point of view, sounds legitimate. I think, it's sort of vacuous. The net effect is, I think, if the world wants to help, they need to pursue the options that you've described, and I think Egypt, bordering with Gaza should help, for example. I mean, it's for the people stuck in that awful situation. Who can imagine? It's absolutely
it is.
Dreadful.
I think what's horrible about it is that I think we should make clear that, so from my perspective, I'm not pro-Israel, I'm not pro-Palestinian, I am pro-humanity in all of this. I just don't.
And that's where we started.
No, exactly. The tragedy is here that politically, I absolutely get Israel is entitled to self-defense. There were heinous acts that happened on that 7th of October day. But now with over 28,000 Palestinians have lost their lives. Apparently over 67,000 are injured. 2/3 of those children a humanitarian crisis, lots of Gaza flattened, and now we're on the cusp of the most bloody phase ever. And even if Israel goes in, which looks likely they will that make Israel safer? I just can't see it. The devastation that's been caused, the faces of those young kids that have lost fathers and whatever, it just doesn't feel like there's a political endgame that is going to be sustainable.
Well, my view on it, I mean, Israel was saying we are rooting out an evil and we're going to go to the bottom of that evil and eradicate it. They might eradicate, quotes, Hamas, but Hamas is funded and driven from an ideological point of view by Iran. They're not going to stop Iran, who've got their tentacles and their proxy capabilities all over the place. In fact, across the world. So it's actually a much bigger issue. So I hear that Putin has introduced some new technology to his armory, his weaponry, something hypersonic called Zircon or something it sounds like that rock that kills Superman or something to me. I mean, in my naivety. What is it, Sean?
Yeah, the names, I don't know where they get some of these names from, but it's another of the hypersonic. Remember the Kinzhal missile that was a hypersonic missile that was used earlier in the war with Ukraine that President Putin claimed was undefeatable. There's no answer to this. It flies at Mach 5 or something, and therefore it's very difficult to shoot down. They try to use the example, if I fired a bullet at you, how do you intercept that bullet? Because it's not in flight for very long. It's moving so fast. It's very difficult to find something that can track it, predict it, fire something, get there in time. So a bullet fires over Mach 1, but if you're now into Mach 5, it's really difficult to shoot these things down. And yet, Patriot system introduced in the 1970s, yes, it evolved quite a lot over that time, but it does appear to have shot down some of these Kinzhals.
So you got a missile here, you've got this ground-based defence system here, this fires at Mach 5, this thing here predicts where it's going to be, so it fires, and it knows it's going to be there, and it takes it out. That's pretty impressive.
It's very impressive. Now, part of this also is to work out, just because it's called Mach 5, well, let's get on to your... so Zircon is the next generation of the missile. Apparently this goes up to Mach 9, so it's even faster. And apparently the Russians are introducing this now, even though they've done some test firings. They're not really past the operational level yet, but they clearly want to introduce it early. But it's even more difficult to shoot down. But it's worth pointing out that if you have ballistic missiles, the advantage of ballistic missiles is they go into space and then come down again. In space, there is no drag. So you can go very fast in space. You can just keep accelerating. So some of these missiles, when they get launched, they do go hypersonic. But of course, when they come back into the Earth's atmosphere, the drag starts to slow them down, and the heat, and inevitably the viscosity of the air, it becomes more and more drag. So they're not doing Mach 9 all the time. They might be doing Mach 9, and they're slowing down, still very fast, as they approach their target. So I think part of the solution for shooting them down tends to be near the target rather than in space. But you remember the Star Wars initiative that came up for some years ago? All of this was, how do you take out ballistic missiles in space? But the deeper issue here is that this is all scary because Russia's got these. Why hasn't America got them? Well, America tested hypersonic missiles and said they're a bit faster than ballistic missiles, but they're just as difficult to shoot down. And they're about a third more expensive than ballistic missiles. So I've no doubt America has its own collection of very clever capability. The point being is that often in the military world, you don't want to show your enemy the full capability suite you've got.
So you think it's all talk?
Well, no, but I think the danger is Russia's being forced to push stuff that's its cutting edge into conflict. So the West goes, they've got that. Let's work quietly on how we defend against that. Do you remember the Gulf War? I mean, back in the F-117, the sort of night fighter, that little delta wing, stealthy aeroplane.
I love the way you say Do you remember the F-117? And I'm tempted to go, yeah, but no, I don't.
No, but it was a big. It was a big thing in the Gulf War that it was the first time the Americans were going to go in at night, single seat jets that were stealthy, couldn't be seen. They'd never been seen before, but they'd been in service 10 years earlier. They were developed by the American Skunk Works. What a great name! And they were, but America never showed them off because it wanted them to be available for the day that they are needed, and nobody would know how effective they were. Wouldn't have been able to work out how to shoot them down. Now they're all retired now, but in the same way, you know, this missile, this new Zircon missile, is brand new. In fact, it's not even in service properly yet. Putin's having to field it, which means he's showing the West what it can do.
So, Sean, what we need then, we need you to keep track of this magic thing, Zircon, and give us an update when it was first used and how effective it was.
If only I could know that sort of stuff. I think what's been interesting is a lot of it depends on what Russia says they're doing. Inevitably, in the same vein, America will not be keen to showcase how it takes these missiles out. It might be that the Patriot has been able to take them out. It might be they need to be taken out in another way, and in a way that we won't necessarily know. There's been a lot of work recently certainly in the last few weeks, of how you use lasers to take out some of these hypersonic.
Yeah, we talked about that.
Yeah, because the laser travels at the speed of light. Obviously, it's a lot easier. You don't have any lag.
Slightly faster than Mach 9?
Slightly faster, slightly faster. Because as you say, if you're firing something to intercept something, you've got to fire ahead of it. If it's doing Mach 9, how far ahead of it do you fire to intercept it?
Basically just put a wall.
And a wall of lead and it flies through it.
That's right.
Yeah, that works.
Yeah.
That works.
Right, so we know how you can actually ferret your way into the truth. So maybe we can be the first to report when it's actually used.
Well, we'll keep an eye on it, because I do think any technology that Russia brings to bear in this, it sounds scary, but the flip side of it is showcasing its cutting-edge capability, which is never a good thing in the military.
Yeah, watch this space. Yeah, I don't know whether this is Putin and Russia being desperate, Sean, or being very clever, but they've come up with a innovative and unusual way of stopping troops advancing past a certain point, haven't they?
They have. This was in the news this week, that it's called the Tsar train. I think largely because the Tsar used to have very long trains. But about 5 miles back from the front line, still in occupied Ukraine, there's widespread reports that Russian forces have assembled a lot of railway carriages on a stretch of railway line to act as a sort of barricade in case the front line of defences folds. And I was intrigued by this because it raises all sorts of questions. First of all, how many trains? It turns out there are 2,100 carriages.
How long is that?
About 13 miles long.
Wow.
So it's almost certain they can't be pulled. The next question is, we go, well, surely they'll just climb through the gaps, go underneath whatever. Of course they can. Troops can. But you don't move forward just as troops. You move forward with armoured vehicles, armoured personnel carriers, light guns, tanks, supply trucks, everything. How would you get those past? Then you go, okay, well, just push them out of the way. Most of these train trucks, they are pretty substantial bits of kit. Certainly the platform with the wheels, etc. So you go, okay, you just blow one apart with a tank shell. Okay, the tank shell will probably blow it up, but would it actually create a hole, or would it just literally shift it a bit? And even if you created a hole, the danger is you create a funnel through which now everybody, the enemy, can all target that funnel. So it's actually a really intriguing use of...
So maybe it's smart then.
Well, who knows? I mean, at the moment, the intelligence folk don't seem to know quite why it's been done. They're postulating that it's to create a barrier. And initially I thought, that sounds a bit odd.
Certainly news, though.
But yeah, and it's a bit innovative because I've never heard of that being done before.
When you said it, I imagined what they'd done. They'd gone to the museum and they'd actually taken the Tsar's train and put it on the tracks.
Well, some of the news items actually have got pictures of Tsar's train, because I don't think I've seen yet a picture available of this extensive line of carriages. But 13 miles, 2,100 carriages. That's quite an undertaking.
As we know, Russia seems to be running out of fighting service personnel. At least 300,000 people, it's been published anyway, have been injured to the point they can't participate, 100,000 of which have died. I don't know whether I believe this, but I've heard that's 85% of their current fighting force. Seems, pretty high. But obviously this is causing Putin a big problem in terms of mobilizing a fighting force. So what's the solution they're pursuing?
Both sides, both Ukraine and Russia, have lost a lot of people in this war. That's one of the reasons that Russia mobilized, 300,000 people, and the numbers, it's very difficult to get to the bottom of them, but as a proportion of their original size of army, it's a significant number have been lost. Now, you can either do another round of mobilization. Putin seems reluctant to do that, particularly on the eve of a presidential election, because he doesn't want to be seen. But the other way of keeping people in, which he has announced, is to extend their terms of service. In other words, rather than they used to be able to leave at the age of 51, apparently they've now mandated that it's 65 for troops and 70 for officers. So therefore you stop people leaving. What's fascinating, I think, is that pre-war, your life expectancy in Russia was about 64 years old. That's when the average Russian would have passed away. So by extending your service to 65 years or 70 in the case of officers, you're effectively making this a lifetime commitment to the service. That is really odd, really weird. Now, is it going to change materially Russia's frontline fighting capability? Well, with the greatest respect to our 70-year-olds around, they're not going to be the most active and dynamic on the battlefield. So it's not going to change the battlefield dynamics. Oh, here we go.
So I'm 73 next birthday, Sean.
Yeah.
And here's a video taken this morning, funny enough, by chance, of me at the gym.
Go on, Ben.
So I think we'll have less of the 70-year-olds unable to match on the battlefield, if you will. But it's a problem. Mobilizing, sounds like you just recruit people. You've got to train them, prepare them. You've got to, clothing will have been lost, weapons will have been lost on the battlefield. All of that string of things just to get a person to the front fighting has to be done as well. That's an enormous task.
And as you say, it's even more complicated than that, because when you get somebody there, you've done all that training, they are still a rookie. They have no experience whatsoever. There's absolutely no replacement for battlefield experience.
And they're scared.
And therefore, if you can keep experienced folks on for longer, you get a disproportionate benefit in terms of experience. The downside is that you are clearly exceptional when it comes to physical attributes, but generally speaking, an army you want to have as a bunch of youngsters who can take the knocks, are very fit, and a great deal of endurance. And so this won't help them with that, but it will help with their experience.
Yeah. This looks like it's going on and on.
Not stopping anytime soon.
No. A couple of days ago, 2 male hostages were rescued and extracted from Gaza by an elite Israeli force. In general, Sean, that sounds like a much more complicated operation than one might imagine. What has to go into that in general for that to be successful?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of things first. First of all, the timing of this is interesting, because Netanyahu's under a lot of pressure for doing more to get the hostages out. And therefore, I don't think it's coincidence that for the first time we've seen an operation to actually get 2 hostages out. So we've got to be careful what we know, what we don't know, and especially when you talk about special forces operations. Generally speaking, you would never hear about these. So the very fact we're hearing about it being a special forces operation, I think, has a political connotation. It's not just about the operation. But the special forces stuff, having been involved with the special forces, not directly but indirectly for a lot of my military career, first of all, it's an elite force. You don't use it very often. You use it for special occasions. Secondly, to do this, you've got to find the hostages.
That's just before you do anything else, that's pretty tricky. It may be, discounting the fact of the tragedy that's going on over there, actually pretty amazing.
It is, and part of that is going to be a combination of surveillance, of watching known points and see if you can use data recognition software and stuff like that. Some of it will be in the electronic sphere. Inevitably, Hamas will still be communicating with themselves. Some of that will be on landlines, some will be on telephone lines, some of that will be other means. A lot of those can be intercepted. But again, you have to cross-check all of this. Thirdly, you've got to know pattern of life, because the hostages may be there today, but they may not be there tomorrow. Are they there every other day?
So somebody's observing.
Correct. And it might be you've got people on the ground that are actually in Gaza, watching, looking, communicating, putting their lives at danger. Then you have to dream up this plan, and you know that if the hostages are there, they are going to be protected. Hamas will have layers of protection there.
Yeah, not just where they are, but around as well, because these hostages, as you said before, are incredibly valuable, tokens in the negotiation that goes on with war. And so these hostages were in a domestic property, in a house. Apparently, the let's call them the special forces, were dropped by helicopter 150 meters from the house. Probably came down by ropes. Probably difficult to land. They walked to the house, which apparently took an hour of quiet walking. And then they went into attack mode. They put shape charges on the door, blasted the door open. Then, of course, all hell broke loose. And there was a lot of small arms fire all of a sudden. Exactly as you've said, Sean, there were a lot of people there, presumably from Hamas, protecting those hostages. That protective force of Hamas was wiped out. No Israeli forces, according to the news, were affected. What came next, which we'll come on to, was then getting them out. So, I don't know, but that sounds like pretty textbook if you're going to undergo a fairly delicate operation like that.
Yeah, again, I would always caveat that we're only being fed this information from the Israeli side. We've not really heard anything from Hamas about this, and we never should forget the political agenda that underpins all this. But at face value, if you look at the sort of numbers of Hamas that apparently died, and both hostages seem to be extracted unharmed, and we haven't had any reports of any of the Israelis being hurt, that for a special forces operation is phenomenally successful, because you can't know everything. When the special forces go in there, they will know a lot about their building, about pattern of life, but they will not know exactly where everybody is, how they're armed, whether they're awake or asleep, whether they're looking the right way, pointing the right way, the element of chance in all of this as well. And of course, the very fact that they spent an hour making their way to the house in a very densely populated part of they will have been seen. So what do you get dressed in? Do you get dressed as Palestinians?
Quite.
Or do you get dressed as special forces with night vision goggles and the like? There's just so many details here.
A lot to go wrong as well.
A lot to go wrong, yeah.
So they've got these two hostages. They've now got to extract them. They've got to get out of the house, the building, which is apparently an apartment up on the first or second floor. As they came out of the building, they suffered huge barrage of gunfire from an adjacent building. And what then happened, apparently, is the Israeli force had already positioned drones over the building and, in fact, an aircraft. And together, they took out the building from which the barrage of fire was coming, then extracted the hostages to a helicopter and back home.
I think one of the things that is impressive about the planning of these operations is that, as you described it, they go in, they get the hostages. That's only part of the answer. You have now stirred up a hornet's nest. You're in the middle of shark-infested custard. You are now you went in there covertly by blowing up the door, by killing lots of people. Everybody knows you're there now. and you are surrounded.
Yeah.
So part of this now is the element of surprise. Part of this now is you've got to move fast. Part of this, you've got to have a plan to get out and get out swiftly. And also, having stirred up that hornet's nest, you need to have top cover that is able to take out those threats pretty swiftly, create a scene of devastation, but also people just not knowing what's going on. That uncertainty with people looking around just not knowing what's happened. And then you use that confusion to get out and then get extracted. But overall, just imagine the heartbeats of the special forces going in there. Just imagine what the hostages felt like. They wouldn't almost certainly not have known that they were going to be rescued.
No, they apparently didn't realise when they were grabbed. They actually didn't know what was going on.
No.
It was quite sort of resistant to start with.
Yeah.
I mean, thanks for that, Sean. That was a brilliant explanation of all the bits that go together to make an operation like that successful.
But it's also the other
really
bit, though, I think, is that when you get them out, that is not the end of the journey for the hostages. For many of them, they've been there for several months. Who knows what treatment they've had? They will now be thrown back into the limelight. They're now going to be fed properly. They've survived when actually a lot of their fellow hostages have not. Who knows how they've suffered, the memories, the trauma and everything. And they'll be the centre of media attention when they get back home, when probably they just want to return to normal life. This is not the end of the story for the hostages. Yeah, sure. And they're the subject of all of this as well.
Thanks.